What year is it right now? You'd probably say 2026. But according to a theory proposed in 1991, you'd be wrong by 297 years. The phantom time hypothesis claims that the years 614 to 911 AD never happened. They were fabricated. Charlemagne never existed. The Viking Age was misdated. Islamic scholars, Chinese emperors, and European kings all somehow agreed to add 3 centuries to the calendar that never actually occurred. It sounds insane, but for about 60 seconds, the math actually seems to work. This is the story of the phantom time hypothesis.
Where history speaks.
In 1991, a German historian named Heribert Illig published a paper with an audacious claim: the early Middle Ages were a hoax. Working with a systems analyst named Hans-Ulrich Niemitz, Illig argued that the period from 614 to 911 AD, nearly 3 centuries, was inserted into the timeline by medieval rulers who wanted to rewrite history. Why would anyone do this? Who benefits from adding 297 years to the calendar? Illig pointed to 3 men: Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. The theory goes like this. Otto III ruled at the end of the 10th century, but he was obsessed with Christian millennialism. He desperately wanted to rule during the year 1000 AD, a perfect prophetic number marking the start of a new age. The problem? It was only around 700 AD. So according to Illig, Otto conspired with the Pope and the Byzantine Emperor to fabricate roughly 297 years of history. They created fake documents, backdated architecture, and invented a legendary king to give the timeline legitimacy. That king was Charlemagne, crowned emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800, considered the father of both France and Germany. Illig claims he never existed. He was a composite character invented to fill a timeline that never happened. Now this sounds like conspiracy nonsense, but Illig didn't just make this up. He pointed to what he considered genuine problems in the historical record. First, there's the architecture. Hans-Ulrich Niemitz looked at the Palatine Chapel in Aachen, Germany, supposedly built by Charlemagne around 800 AD. He argued that the style of the arches and the construction techniques were far too advanced for that time period. To him, it looked like a building from the 11th century, not the 9th. If it was really built when historians claim, it would be an anachronism, a piece of the future dropped into the past. Second, the archaeological record for the early Middle Ages is surprisingly thin. There aren't many buildings. There aren't many artifacts. The layers of dirt archaeologists dig through, called stratigraphy, sometimes seem to skip over this period entirely. Illig and Niemitz call this the phantom gap. If 3 centuries of people lived, built, and died during this time, where is the evidence? But the piece of evidence that makes people stop and actually think is the calendar. This is the smoking gun for phantom time theorists. In 45 BC, Julius Caesar introduced the Julian calendar. It was a massive improvement over the chaotic Roman system, but it wasn't perfect. The Julian year is 365.25 days long. The actual solar year, the time it takes Earth to orbit the Sun, is about 365.242 days. That's a difference of roughly 11 minutes per year. Doesn't sound like much, but over centuries, those 11 minutes add up. By the 16th century, the calendar had drifted so far out of sync with the seasons that Easter was sliding towards summer. The Catholic Church wasn't happy. So in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar, the one we still use today. His astronomers calculated that the calendar had drifted by 10 days. To fix it, Pope Gregory simply deleted them. October 4th, 1582 was followed by October 15th, 1582. 10 days vanished overnight. Here's where the phantom time hypothesis gets interesting. Illich did the math. If the Julian calendar started in 45 BC and ran until 1582 AD, that's 1,627 years. Multiply that by the 11-minute annual error and you get a total drift of about 13 days. But Pope Gregory only deleted 10 days. Where did the other 3 days go? Illich's answer? They represent roughly 300 years of time that never actually happened. If you calculate how long it takes to accumulate a 3-day drift, you get somewhere between 300 and 325 years, depending on exactly how you do the math. Illich claimed the fabricated period was 614 to 911 AD, exactly 297 years. But notice the problem. The calendar calculation says roughly 325 years. His specific claim is 297 years. His own math doesn't match his proposal. That's a 28-year discrepancy. Still, the argument is compelling on the surface. It uses math. It uses astronomy. It uses the well-known fact that the early Middle Ages are called the Dark Ages for a reason. We just don't have a lot of information from that time. And for about 60 seconds, it actually seems possible. Then you check the math. The calendar argument falls apart immediately once you understand what Pope Gregory was actually trying to do. Illich assumed the Pope was realigning the calendar to the time of Julius Caesar in 45 BC. He wasn't. Pope Gregory was realigning the calendar to the Council of Nicaea, which took place in 325 AD. The Council of Nicaea was the event that standardized the date for Easter. The Catholic Church didn't care about Julius Caesar. They cared about the Church Fathers who defined Easter. If you calculate the drift between 325 AD and 1582 AD, you get 1,257 years. Multiply that by 11 minutes per year, and you get a drift of 9.8 days. Pope Gregory dropped 10 days. The math is perfect. There are no missing centuries. Illich just started his calculation from the wrong starting point. That's the end of the calendar argument. But even if we ignored that mistake, the phantom time hypothesis has a much bigger problem. The rest of the world exists. Illich's theory is deeply Eurocentric. It assumes the Dark Ages were dark everywhere. They weren't. Let's look at the years 618 to 907 AD. According to Illich, this is the Phantom Zone, a stretch of fake history. But in China, this period is called the Tang Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty is one of the most well-documented eras in Chinese history. We have detailed tax records. We have lists of emperors. We have accounts of the Anlushan Rebellion, a massive civil war that killed millions of people between 755 and 763 AD. If you erase 300 years from the timeline, you have to explain why the Chinese chroniclers wrote thousands of pages describing events that supposedly never happened. Did Emperor Otto III convince the Emperor of China to fake his own dynasty? This seems like a bit of a far stretch. And it's not just China. The Phantom Time period covers the rise of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad died in 632 AD. The subsequent expansion of the Islamic caliphates across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain happened during the exact centuries Illich says didn't exist. We have coins, we have buildings, we have texts from the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates. We know about the Battle of Talas in 751 AD, where Islamic forces fought the Tang dynasty. This battle is historically significant because it's how paper-making technology spread from China to the Islamic world and eventually to Europe. For phantom time to be true, you'd have to erase the Prophet Muhammad, the entire Islamic Golden Age, and one of China's greatest dynasties. You'd have to assume historians from Baghdad to Beijing all agreed to fabricate the same 300 years. And even if you could explain that, the physical evidence gets worse for the theory. The most devastating evidence against phantom time comes from the sky. Astronomy doesn't lie. The movement of the planets and stars is governed by physics. We can calculate exactly where celestial objects were at any point in the past. We can rewind the solar system. Ancient civilizations recorded solar eclipses. Islamic astronomers in the 9th century documented eclipses visible from Baghdad. Chinese astronomers recorded eclipses during the Tang Dynasty. When modern astronomers calculate where the sun and moon were during those years, the records match perfectly. If we were missing 300 years, the eclipses wouldn't line up. The sun and moon would be in completely different positions. And then there's Halley's Comet. Halley's Comet orbits the sun every 76 years. It's been recorded for over 2,000 years. We have sightings from 240 BC, 164 BC, 87 BC, 12 BC, and then regularly through the late antiquity. During the supposed phantom period, Halley's Comet appeared in 684, 760, 837, and 912 AD. These sightings are recorded in European, Chinese, and Islamic texts. The 837 appearance was particularly notable. Chroniclers describe it as terrifyingly bright. If you remove 300 years from history, you break the 76-year cycle. You can't fake orbital mechanics. But if the stars aren't enough, we can look at the Earth itself. Dendrochronology is the science of dating events using tree rings. Every year, a tree grows a new ring. By matching patterns of ring widths in living trees with old timber from ancient buildings, scientists have created an unbroken timeline of tree rings going back over 12,000 years. There is no gap. The timeline is continuous. And buried in those rings is proof that the 8th century was real. In the years 774 to 775 AD, something extraordinary happened. There was a massive spike in carbon-14 in Earth's atmosphere. Scientists believe it was caused by an enormous solar flare or a gamma-ray burst from space, one of the most powerful cosmic events to hit Earth in recorded history. This event, called the Miyake event, left a radioactive fingerprint in tree rings all over the world. We find this exact spike in oak trees in Germany, in pine trees in Siberia, in cedar trees in Japan. It's a global marker anchoring the timeline firmly in the 8th century, right in the middle of the supposed phantom time. Ice cores tell the same story. Annual layers in Greenland and Antarctic ice can be counted like tree rings, and they show volcanic eruptions that match historical records perfectly. The timeline holds. You cannot fake tree rings, you cannot fake ice cores, and you cannot fake the orbit of a comet. The phantom time hypothesis isn't just wrong, it's impossible. So if the math is wrong, the global history contradicts it, the stars prove it false, and the trees don't lie, why does the phantom time hypothesis still come up? Because the early Middle Ages really are murky. We have fewer documents from Western Europe during this period than from Rome or the Renaissance. And forgeries were rampant in the Middle Ages. Monks really did fake land deeds and saintly relics. Illig wasn't wrong that medieval history is messy. He just mistook a lack of evidence in one region for a lack of time itself. He took a real problem, unreliable sources and sparse archaeology in early medieval Europe, and proposed a solution that was far too big for the problem. The Dark Ages happened. The Tang Dynasty happened. Charlemagne was real. And it is, in fact, 2026. Probably. If you liked the video and want to be notified as soon as a new episode is released, please consider hitting the like button and subscribe. And if you want a specific historical topic that might be unknown to a lot of people covered here, leave a comment. Thank you for watching and stay curious.